What if your dog knew a secret no one else could hear? For weeks, Harold's loyal companion barked at the same old oak tree, relentless, restless, as neighbors mocked and the sheriff brushed it off. But when Harold finally listened, the tree revealed something buried for over a century. Bones, journals, and a seal that decided who was worthy to guard its truth. This wasn't just about treasure, it was a test. And only a stubborn man and his faithful dog had the patience to pass it. Would you have listened or walked away? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. Harold Whitaker had lived in Stonefield, Vermont, long enough to know every fence post, dirt road, and weathered tree along his property line. Retirement had slowed him, but not dulled his awareness. Each morning, he made coffee the same way he had for 30 years, poured it into the same chipped enamel mug, and stepped out to watch the fog lift over the fields. The rhythms of his life were simple, predictable, and steady, until Scout, his 6-year-old shepherd mix, began breaking them. At first, it was nothing unusual. Dogs bark, they chase squirrels, growl at raccoons, and defend the yard from delivery trucks. Harold thought little of it when Scout began spending long stretches near the oak that rose at the far edge of the property. The tree was an old sentinel, twisted and scarred by weather, so large that 2 men could not reach around its base. Harold had grown up with that tree in view. As a boy, he had seen its branches catch the winter's snow until they cracked under the weight. As a young man, he had leaned against its trunk, carving initials with a pocket knife while waiting for a girl who never came. Nothing about it had ever struck him as strange. But Scout seemed to see it differently. The barking began at dawn, sharp, insistent, not the kind that broke off after a squirrel fled into the brush. Scout would stand rigid before the trunk, hackles raised, teeth bare at the hollow that split the oak surface. Hour after hour, his deep-chested voice echoed across the fields, until Harold had to drag him back by the collar. The dog strained against him, returning again and again, as if something inside that tree commanded his attention. Neighbors noticed. In a small town, everything drew comment, and Harold's dog had become a source of laughter. That much protecting you from firewood, joked one of the men at the diner. Another claimed Scout must have cornered a groundhog inside and couldn't let it go. Harold chuckled with them, but the truth was that unease had begun to creep into his evenings. Scout was not a foolish animal. He was steady, reliable, and sharper than many dogs Harold had owned. He didn't bark at shadows. Late one night, unable to sleep, Harold stepped out with a lantern. Scout was already there, pacing and whining before the oak. The beam of light fell across the bark, highlighting the dark hollow that split upward like a scar. For a moment, Harold thought he saw something flicker within, as though light reflected off metal buried deep inside. He leaned closer, but Scout lunged suddenly, growling so fiercely that Harold pulled back. The dog wasn't warning him away. He was warning something else. By morning, Harold tried to put out of his mind. He had lived long enough to know how easily the imagination could run away with a man, especially when nights grew long and quiet. But he couldn't ignore the persistence. Each day, Scout returned. Each day, he barked with the same desperation, the same urgency that seemed less like an instinct and more like a message. Harold found himself drawn to the tree, too, studying the grooves in its bark, the way the roots twisted out of the earth like bones. He pressed his hand against the trunk and felt a vibration so faint he might have dismissed it as his own pulse, except it came from within the wood. The tree had stood for over 2 centuries. Families had come and gone. Storms had stripped shingles from roofs and washed out roads, but the oak remained. Locals called it the Sentinel. Children had grown up spinning ghost stories about it, whispering of travelers who vanished near its roots generations ago. Harold had always dismissed those tales as the kind of lore every town invents to entertain itself. Now, with Scout restless at his side, those stories returned with weight he had never given them before. He began to notice details he had overlooked his whole life. Carvings faintly etched into the bark, not initials but patterns, lines intersecting like crude symbols. When the light fell at a certain angle in the late afternoon, they stood out as if freshly cut. He tried tracing it with his fingertips, but the bark was rough and splintered, resisting any clear interpretation. Scout grew worse with time. He refused food until Harold followed him to the oak. He pawed at the ground near its roots, scraping furrows into the soil as if trying to dig something out. Harold scolded him at first, but when he bent down to inspect the disturbed earth, he found fragments of rusted metal buried shallow beneath. They were too corroded to identify, but one piece bore the curve of deliberate shaping, not something the forest would leave on its own. By the third week, Harold stopped trying to explain it away. He knew his neighbors would shake their heads if he told them. They had always seen him as a solitary old man with too much time on his hands, someone who needed a hobby more than a mystery. But each morning, Scout's voice carried across the valley, refusing to be silenced. Whatever had taken root inside that tree, it was not meant to stay hidden forever. Harold felt a shift within himself, a quiet certainty he could not dismiss. This was no longer about a dog's stubbornness or an old man's imagination. Something waited inside the sentinel, and Scout had been trying all along to make him see it. The mornings grew repetitive, and yet each one unsettled Harold more than the last. Scout no longer wandered the yard as he once had, sniffing fence posts or chasing birds from the grass. Now the dog seemed tethered to the oak by some unseen command. The moment Harold opened the back door, Scout bolted across the field, straight to the same hollow, where the air seemed to thicken with tension. He barked until his voice went hoarse, pawed until his nails split, then sat rigid with ears pricked forward, growling at whatever secret lay beyond the bark. Harold told himself it was nothing. Dogs would be strange, obsessive, but Scout wasn't simply playing out an odd quirk. This was something deeper, a fixation that consumed him day and night. When Harold tried to drag him away on the leash, the dog strained with his full weight, chest heaving, eyes never leaving the tree. Even at night, Scout refused to come from his bed on the porch, instead positioning himself at the far end of the property where he could keep watch. The oak itself offered no answers. Its trunk was thick, wider than Harold remembered, the hollow rising from its base like a wound that had slowly expanded over centuries. He leaned against it one morning, palm flat against the bark, and felt something that chilled him, a faint tremor, not constant, but rhythmic, like tapping from within. He pulled his hand back quickly, telling himself it was only his imagination, or the vibration of what's settling after cold nights. But when he returned the next day, the sensation was there again, pulsing faintly under his touch. He didn't speak of it to anyone. The last time he had mentioned Scout's behavior at the diner, the men had laughed it off, telling him to get the dog neutered or buy him a chew toy. Their voices had been light, but Harold knew what they thought. The old man was letting the mutt drive him half mad. He decided silence was better. Still, he could not ignore what he felt, and each morning he found himself testing it again, pressing his hand to the bark while Scout whined beside him. The tapping remained, elusive but undeniable, as though the tree were trying to communicate. The sound began to creep into Harold's nights. He would wake in the dark, ears straining, convinced he heard the same faint rhythm through the walls of his farmhouse. At first he thought it was the clock in the hallway, ticking louder than usual. Then he silenced the clock, and still the noise persisted, a subtle pattern that seemed to rise from the ground itself. He would sit on the edge of his bed, listening, until Scout's distant barking confirmed that the dog heard it too. Curiosity became stronger than his unease. One morning, Harold fetched a small hammer from the shed and tapped the oak's trunk. The hollow rang differently than he expected. Not empty, not solid. Something in between, as though layers would conceal the space filled with more than air. He tried in different spots, listening for variation, and each time the dog responded with frenzied barking, as if urging him to keep going. The longer Harold studied it, the more he noticed things he had missed before. Around the hollow, faint grooves spiraled to the bark in deliberate lines, half swallowed by time. They weren't like initials carved by careless hands. They formed patterns, repeating shapes that almost resembled constellations. When sunlight struck at certain angles, the designs emerged clearer, giving the impression that whoever had carved them intended them to be seen only under particular conditions. Scout pawed at these markings constantly, scraping away bark until small fragments scattered across the roots. One afternoon, crouched low to follow the dog's scratches, Harold caught sight of something beneath the layers of bark, a glint of metal, almost like a nail head but too finely made. He dug at it with his pocket knife, careful not to damage it, but the bark closed tight around the object, hiding more than it revealed. He stepped back, unsettled, while Scout pressed his nose into the hollow and whimpered. Harold began to question how long the tree had stood there and what might have been hidden within it over the centuries. Locals called it the Sentinel because it seemed older than the town itself, older even than the stone foundations left behind by early settlers. It had survived storms that leveled barns, fires that tore through the valley, and winters that froze rivers solid. People spoke of it as if it were a landmark, permanent and reliable, yet no one had ever claimed to understand it. The tapping returned with new strength after a heavy rainstorm. Water had seeped into the hollow, darkening the bark. When Harold pressed his hand there, the vibration seemed stronger, more insistent, as though whatever lay inside had been stirred by the storm. Scout's barking grew frantic, his paws digging until dirt sprayed against Harold's boots. He pulled the dog back, but his own heartbeat quickened as he stared into the hollow. For the first time, he thought he heard not just tapping but a faint echo, as if something shifted deep inside the trunk. That night, Harold sat on his porch with a lantern burning beside him, watching the oak in the distance. Scout lay tense at his feet, eyes locked on the tree, ears twitching at every sound. The field was quiet, the crickets muted by the dampness, but Harold felt the same steady rhythm rising through the ground, carried on the night air. It was not imagination, not coincidence. The tree was alive with more than roots and sap. Something inside it was waiting to be found. The oak had always been there, long before Harold Whitaker was born, long before his father's boots first crossed the field. It stood like a monument to time itself, its gnarled branches reaching wide across the sky, its roots gripping the soil as though they were holding secrets no man had a right to touch. People in town called it the Sentinel, and the name carried a quiet weight. Whenever it was spoken, it wasn't just a tree. It was a witness, a survivor of centuries, and to some, a keeper of things better left undisturbed. When Harold was a boy, he had heard the stories whispered about the grove. They were the sort of tales children shared in hushed voices, daring each other go near the oak at night. One boy claimed that his grandfather once saw lanterns moving among the roots, bobbing like restless spirits, though when he approached, the lights vanished without a trace. Another spoke of a farmhand who disappeared on his way home one evening, last seen walking past a grove with a lantern of his own. His body was never recovered, and the only thing left behind was the iron hook of his belt buckle, found at the base of the tree years later. Most grown men dismissed these tales as folklore, the kind of legends that cling to anything old enough to have outlived generations. But even the skeptics treated the Sentinel with a certain respect. Loggers who cleared other stands of timber left it untouched, calling it too crooked for useful lumber, though Harold suspected the real reason was something deeper. They didn't want to anger it. The farmhouse Harold lived in had been built in the mid-1800s, and his own great-grandfather had written notes in a family journal about the oak being ancient even then. He described its branches as twisted like a fist, and its roots as buried bones of the earth. That phrase has stuck with Harold ever since he first read it. And now, as he stood watching Scout bark and paw at those very roots, he wondered whether his ancestor had known more than he let on. Strange things had happened around the grove over the years. In the late 1920s, a pair of hunters failed to return home after setting out toward the northern woods. Their dogs were found days later circling the Sentinel, whining, but their masters were never seen again. In the 1960s, children dared each other to press their ears against the hollow and swear they could hear a heartbeat. Harold remembered trying it himself once, and though he had laughed nervously with the others, a part of him had heard something faint, something that sounded far too much like the steady thump of life. Now, with Scout returning each morning to bark at the hollow, those stories no longer felt like tales meant to frighten children. They carried the weight of warning. The Sentinel had endured every storm, every winter, and every fire that swept through the valley. Its bark bore scars from lightning strikes, its branches twisted into shapes that resembled skeletal arms. Yet it lived on, thriving when younger trees withered. Something about that endurance felt unnatural. Harold began asking questions in town, though carefully, so as not to invite too much laughter. At the Historical Society, he found a ledger that mentioned the oak in passing. A surveyor in 1812 had marked the grove as an unsuitable site for settlement, owing to unstable ground and local superstition. The phrase made Harold pause. Unstable ground. He thought a scout digging at the roots of the hollow that seemed to echo beneath the bark. Maybe the land had shifted around something buried long ago. Old Mrs. Crawford at the library leaned in close when Harold mentioned the sentinel. Her father, she claimed, once spoke of men who dug near the tree during the Depression, searching for rumored treasure. They never found anything, she said, but 2 of them fell ill soon after, struck by fevers that lingered until they died. She told Harold in a low voice that people believed the oak protected what it held, punishing those who disturbed it. Each story layered on top of the last, forming a picture Harold couldn't ignore. The sentinel wasn't just a tree that had survived the centuries. It was part of the town's hidden history, tied to disappearances, legends, and warnings passed down like folklore. And now his own dog had joined that chain, sounding the alarm not out of superstition but out of instinct. Standing at the edge of the grove, Harold studied the roots spreading outward like veins, some as thick as fence posts, others curling back into the earth as if anchoring something heavy beneath. The soil around them looked disturbed in ways he hadn't noticed before, ridges and depressions that seemed too deliberate to be the work of animals. He crouched low, running his hand across the ground, and felt a hardness just beneath the surface. Not stone, not wood, something else. Scout whined aside, pawing insistently at the same spot. Harold pulled his hand back, suddenly aware of the silence around him. The wind had died, the birds had gone quiet, and only the faint sound of Scout's breath broke the stillness. It felt as though the grove itself was holding its breath, waiting. For the first time, Harold realized the stories weren't only about the past. They were warnings about the present. The sentinel was guarding something, and Scout, for reasons Harold could not yet understand, was determined to reveal it. The storm came on suddenly, rolling over Vermont hills with the kind of force that rattled window panes and drove even the hardiest farmers inside. Harold had been sitting at the kitchen table with a lantern burning low, listening to the rain batter the roof when Scout's bark cut through the thunder. It was sharper than usual, filled with urgency. Harold knew, without needing to look, where the dog had gone. The sentinel always drew him in, as though the old oak had tied a rope around the animal's very spirit. Pulling on his coat, Harold stepped into the downpour. The wind tore at him, pushing sheets of rain sideways across the yard, soaking him in moments. Scout's shape flashed in the lightning ahead, pacing before the oak, barking into the hollow as if the storm itself had come from inside the tree. Harold squinted against the rain and trudged across the field, his boots sinking deep into mud. When he reached the grove, another flash of lightning tore across the sky, striking close enough that the crack of it seemed to shake the earth. For a brief instant, the oak was lit up in stark relief. The bark, which had always seemed impenetrable, glistened with water, but the lightning revealed something more. Long cracks spread outward from the hollow, splitting deeper into the trunk than Harold had ever seen. Inside those jagged openings, something caught the light, a faint gleam of metal wedged among the fibers of the tree. Harold froze, his breath caught in his chest. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't a reflection of water or the trick of his tired eyes. There was something inside the sentinel, something buried so deep the tree itself had grown around it. Scout's growls deepened, his body rigid, hackles standing tall along his spine. The dog's gaze never shifted, fixed entirely on the glinting interior, as though warning Harold that what lay within was no ordinary object. The storm raged on, thunder rolling in endless succession, but Harold's focus narrowed to that hollow. The gleam had been faint, but distinct, the unmistakable shimmer of worked metal, not stone or bark. He moved closer, bracing his hand against the rough trunk, and felt the faint vibration again, the same tapping he had dismissed as imagination days before, but now stronger, clearer. The rhythm seemed to pulse up through his arm, steady, almost deliberate. He pulled back suddenly, shaken by the sensation. The tree stood ancient and immovable, yet somehow alive in a way that unsettled him. Scout whined, then barked again, lunging forward to paw at the hollow. His nails scraped splinters from the softened bark, exposing more of the crack. In the flash of another bolt of lightning, Harold saw what looked like a curved surface within, the edge of something rounded, its contour too perfect to be natural. The rain drove harder, plastering his hair to his forehead. But he couldn't force himself to turn away. His mind raced through possibilities. An old horseshoe nailed in by some forgotten hand, a fragment of farm equipment discarded and swallowed by the growing tree. Yet no explanation seemed to fit. Whatever was inside had the distinct gleam of something intentionally placed, hidden with purpose. Scout's growling deepened until it was almost a rumble, his eyes fixed on a hollow with a mixture of fear and defiance. Harold had known the dog long enough to read his moods. This wasn't the growl of a hunt or the warning at a stranger's approach. It was a growl of something sensed but not understood, the instinctive alarm of a creature that knew danger was close. For the rest of the night, Harold sat by the window, clothes still damp, watching the trees sway in the storm. He couldn't shake the image of that metallic glint, nor the steady rhythm he had felt through the bark. Each flash of lightning illuminated the sentinel, and each time he half expected to see it split apart entirely, exposing whatever lay hidden in its core. When the storm finally broke, leaving the air heavy with damp earth and broken branches, Harold stepped out again with a lantern. The oak stood silent, its surface slick with rain, the cracks still visible though less pronounced in the calm. He approached cautiously, lantern held high, and peered into the hollow. The light caught fragments of the same gleam he had seen before, though dimmer now without the storm's furious energy to illuminate it. His hand trembled as he reached forward, fingertips grazing the wet bark. The vibration remained, subtle but undeniable. It was not the random shifting of a tree, not the settling of wood in the rain. It was deliberate, patterned as though something or someone were knocking from the other side. Scout pressed against his leg, still growling low, his body tense and unyielding. The message was clear enough. Whatever was inside the sentinel had waited a long time, and the storm had revealed just a sliver of its secret. Harold stood there in the damp silence, rain dripping from his coat, and felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The sentinel had not cracked by chance. It was warning him, forcing him to see what it had hidden for generations. And now that he had glimpsed it, there would be no turning back. Word of Harold's strange discovery spread quicker than he intended. He had only mentioned it in passing at the general store, more to ease the weight in his chest than to invite conversation. But in a small town like Stonefield, whispers move like wind through dry leaves. By the next morning, several people had already made comments. Some teased him gently about seeing ghosts in the old oak. Others looked at him with quiet pity, as though the years of solitude had finally caught up to him. Sheriff Daniels stopped by that afternoon. He was a man Harold had known since boyhood, a few years younger, with a round face that had grown heavy with age, but still carried the same air of calm authority. Daniels had spent his whole life in Stonefield, and nothing seemed to rattle him. When he pulled his cruiser into Harold's drive, Scout began barking from the grove, his voice sharp and relentless, as though warning the sheriff away. Daniels leaned against his car door, smiling patiently as Harold approached. "Heard you've got yourself a haunted tree," he said, tipping his hat against the sunlight. His tone carried the easy humor of a man who didn't believe a word of it, but had come anyway out of duty, or perhaps curiosity. "It's not haunted," Harold replied, more defensive than he meant to sound. "Something's inside it. Metal. I saw it when the storm split the bark." The sheriff nodded, following as Harold led him toward the oak. Scout was already there, circling, barking so fiercely that his throat seemed raw. Daniels chuckled under his breath. "That dog of yours ought to be on payroll," he said. "Most reliable alarm system in town." When they reached the tree, Harold gestured toward the hollow. The cracks in the storm were still visible, though drier now. "Put your hand here," he said. "You'll feel it. There's something moving, tapping like it's trying to get out." Daniels raised an eyebrow, but obliged. He pressed his palm flat against the bark, stood for a moment, then shrugged. "Feels like wood to me. Not if you wait. It comes in patterns." Almost like Harold trailed off, struggling to explain. The words sounded foolish even to him, but he knew what it felt. The sheriff rapped his knuckles against the trunk, listening to the echo. "Hollow," he said, stepping back. "Plenty of trees get that way. Doesn't mean there's treasure or a ghost rattling around in there. Probably raccoons or owls." You've seen how they get. Metal doesn't shine like that because of raccoons, Harold pressed. He leaned closer, pointing to where the faint gleam had appeared during the storm. Even in daylight, a trace of it remained, just deep enough to catch the lantern light. Daniel squinted, then laughed softly. You're seeing reflections off rainwater. That's all. The mind plays tricks when you're looking for something. You've been alone too long. Harold, sometimes the imagination fills the silence. Harold's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to insist that it wasn't imagination, but the sheriff's easy dismissal made the words stick in his throat. Daniels clapped him on the shoulder. Tell you what, I'll make a note, just in case anyone else gets spooked. But trees split, creak, echo. That's all there is to it. Nothing dangerous about it. With that, he tipped his hat again, strolled back to his cruiser, and drove off, leaving behind the faint hum of his engine and the silence of the grove. Harold stood staring after him, frustration knotting in his chest. The man had humored him, nothing more. He hadn't felt the tapping, hadn't taken the glint of metal seriously. To Daniels, it was just an old tree and a lonely man's story. But Scout refused to move. Long after the sheriff's car disappeared down the dirt road, the dog remained planted before the hollow, muscles taut, barking until his voice broke into hoarse growls. Harold crouched beside him, running a hand to the damp fur along his neck. I know, he murmured. I saw it too. The oak loomed above them, its branches whispering in the breeze, and Harold felt the same unease rise in him again. The sheriff might have dismissed it, but the dog hadn't. Scout had never wavered. His fixation was not the whim of an anxious animal, but the certainty of instinct. The dog knew something lay buried within that tree, something alive in ways bark and roots could never explain. As the sun sank lower, casting the field in long shadows, Harold stayed with Scout by the sentinel. The tree seemed to absorb the evening light, its hollow darkening into a mouth that swallowed every trace of color. The tapping returned faintly beneath Harold's hand, and this time he didn't doubt it. It wasn't wind. It wasn't water. It was deliberate, steady, waiting. And while Sheriff Daniels might have walked away unconcerned, Harold understood that the sentinel was not done with him, or with the dog who refused to leave its side. The morning after the sheriff's visit, Harold found himself drawn back to the sentinel. He could not shake the echo of Daniels' dismissive tone, nor the weight of the man's hand on his shoulder, the quiet implication that he was simply lonely, perhaps imagining more than was real. But Scout's restless pacing told another story. The dog had barked half the night, scratching at the floorboards near the door as though begging to be let out. When dawn finally arrived, Harold relented. He followed him across the dew-soaked field, shovel in hand, more out of compulsion than intent. The ground around the oak was soft from recent rain, the roots rising from the soil like veins. Scout nosed at one particular spot, whining, then began digging furiously until his paws were caked with mud. Harold stepped forward, muttering that he might as well help if the animal was determined. He sank the shovel into the earth, peeling back clumps of wet soil. The smell of rot and dampness rose up, but beneath it came something sharper, metallic. His shovel struck an object with a hollow clang. He knelt, brushing away the soil with trembling hands, until the outline of a small tin box emerged, rusted and battered, yet intact. Scout barked once, sharply, as if to declare victory, then sat back on his haunches, eyes locked on the object. Harold pried it free from the tangled roots that seemed almost reluctant to let it go. The box was heavier than he expected. Its lid was corroded shut, but with enough pressure from his pocketknife, it gave way, snapping open with a brittle crack. Inside lay a stack of papers bound together, their edges curled and water-stained, but not completely destroyed. He lifted them out gently, surprised to see that the ink had endured. Across the first page, in spidery handwriting, was a date, 1891. Beneath it, a neat list of names, each accompanied by a symbol, crosses, triangles, circles divided by lines, as though part of some private code. Harold squinted at the faded script, reading slowly. The words were clear enough, deliveries to the oak. His pulse quickened. The ledger did not read like a farmer's journal or an account of household expenses. It read like instructions, careful notations of items transferred and received. One entry mentioned iron weights marked with a seal. Another described seal crates, no questions. The handwriting was meticulous, as if the writer expected these records to be found and understood by only a select few. Scout nudged his leg impatiently, as though urging him to keep reading. Harold turned the pages carefully, finding more names, some he vaguely recognized from the oldest gravestones in Stonefield Cemetery. Others were unfamiliar, though their frequency suggested they had been part of something organized. Each name was paired with symbols and dates, stretching over months, then years, all tied to the oak. The word "secure in the hollow" appeared more than once, always underlined, as if to emphasize the importance of that particular hiding place. He sat back against the trunk, rain still dripping from the branches, and tried to make sense of it. What kind of deliveries were being made here? Why keep records at all if secrecy was a point? The entries were too careful to be casual. They carried the precision of men who knew their work mattered, not just in their own time, but in the years that would follow. One passage caught his eye. October 3rd, 1891, final deposit made. All accounted for. Sentinel will stand as guardian until reckoning. May those who seek be judged worthy. The words chilled him. This wasn't simply bookkeeping. It was a vow, written with the certainty of someone who believed the oak was more than a tree. It was a sentinel in truth, charged with holding whatever they had left behind. Harold turned another page and found sketches in the margins. Simple geometric designs, repeating shapes that matched the faint carvings he had noticed on the bark weeks earlier. Triangles interlocked with circles, lines stretching like compass points. The symbols weren't random. They were instructions, coordinates, perhaps meant for someone who knew how to read them. Closing the box, Harold felt the weight of the ledger in his hands, heavier than the tin that held it. This was no artifact of casual history. It was evidence, a record of something hidden deliberately, and hidden here. He looked at Scout, who still sat fixed on the hollow, ears twitching, body tense. The dog hadn't brought him to scraps of junk. He had brought him to a secret the town had either forgotten or chosen to bury. The sheriff had laughed. The neighbors had whispered. But Harold knew better now. Something had been hidden in the Sentinel more than a century ago, and the men who placed it there expected it to endure, guarded by wood and roots until right eyes found it. As he tucked the ledger under his arm and rose to his feet, the oak groaned softly in the breeze, as though acknowledging that one more layer of its silence had been broken. And Harold understood, with a certainty he could not explain, that the tree still held more. The ledger was not the answer. It was only the beginning. The discovery of the ledger left Harold restless. He could hardly sleep, the faded handwriting circling in his mind long after he set the book aside. Sentinel will stand as guardian until reckoning. The words looped through him like a refrain, growing heavier the more he turned them over. Whatever had been hidden here had not been meant for everyone. It had been left for someone willing or foolish enough to look deeper. Scout had not grown any calmer after the find. If anything, his fixation sharpened. He prowled the oak at every opportunity, circling, sniffing, pawing, as though the ledger's unearthly confirmed his suspicions. Harold tried to distract him, calling him back toward the house with biscuits, whistling sharply when the barking wore on, but the dog refused to be pulled away for long. His body trembled with a need Harold could only describe as knowing. Scout had sensed this long before Harold ever touched a spade to the soil. One damp afternoon, when the sky hung low and gray and the air smelled of rain yet to fall, Harold followed Scout back to the hollow. The dog pressed his paws against the bark, scratching furiously. At first Harold thought he was only marking his obsession again, but when flakes of rotted wood fell away, something caught Harold's eye. Beneath the rough outer layer, carved into the older, darker grain, lines began to show. At first they were faint, shallow grooves that might have passed for scars. But the more Scout clawed, the more their true form appeared. Harold knelt, brushing the bark shavings aside. He traced the shapes with a finger, and a shiver ran up his arm. These weren't natural splits or cracks. They had been cut by human hands. The lines crossed and intersected, forming a lattice of geometric patterns that looked strangely deliberate. Circles overlapped with triangles. Straight lines extended like compass points, and small cross marks punctuated their intersections. His thoughts went immediately to the ledger. He hurried back to the farmhouse and returned with the water-damaged book, careful not to disturb its fragile pages. There, sketched in the margins beside the names and dates, were the same shapes. Cruder, perhaps, drawn by hand rather than carved into wood, but unmistakably the same. Scout barked once, sharply, and pawed again, as though urging him to continue. Harold pressed closer to the tree, lantern in hand though daylight still lingered, and held the flame near the carvings. The light cast shadows into the grooves, making the patterns clearer. They spread outward from the hollow, not just random marks but an arrangement, as though part of a larger design. The longer he stared, the more the symbols seemed to shift in meaning. They were not language in any form he recognized, but they carried a logic, a rhythm, as if they were telling a story through geometry rather than words. Compass points suggested direction. Circles looked like maps, triangles like markers, and together they formed something larger than the sum of their parts. He flipped through the ledger again and found one particular entry dated late in 1891. Second lattice secured. Marked for those who know. To all others, meaningless grain. Harold muttered the words aloud, tasting their weight. The men who had written this had expected the tree itself to hold their secret. They had cut their code into living wood, trusting that time would conceal it until someone patient enough or desperate enough peeled back the layers. As the evening shadows stretched across the field, Harold worked with his pocket knife, carefully scraping away more of the softened bark. Each stroke revealed more of the design, an expanding web of lines that spread beyond what he had first imagined. Scout sat beside him, ears pricked, eyes following every movement as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. When Harold paused, lantern raised high, the carving stretched like a star chart across the trunk. The symbols aligned with uncanny precision to the sketches in a ledger. It was no accident. Whoever had marked the sentinel had done so with purpose. And Harold realized with a tightening in his chest that the ledger was more than a record. It was a key. The marks in the tree were its lock. He traced one circle at the center of the lattice, then compared it to a similar circle inked on the ledger page. Beside it, in faded script, was a note. Doorway of grain. Harold whispered the phrase, glancing toward the hollow. The cracks from the storm seemed deeper now, as though the tree itself had shifted to accommodate its secret. Scout growled low, the sound vibrating in his chest. His eyes locked on the hollow, steady and unblinking. Harold swallowed hard. The sheriff might have dismissed him. The neighbors might have laughed. But the evidence was here in living wood and faded ink. The sentinel was not simply an oak. It was a vault, a marker, a silent witness to a promise made more than a century ago. And now its carvings, hidden beneath years of bark, were revealing themselves. Harold felt the tremor again when his hand pressed flat against the designs, a faint rhythm, like the pulse of the tree itself. He could not tell if it was the earth beneath him or something moving within, but it confirmed what he already knew. The sentinel's secret was real, and the symbols were its warning as much as its guide. The last light of day slipped below the horizon, and still Harold remained at the base of the tree, the ledger open on his knee, Scout keeping guard. The old oak had begun to speak, not in words but in grain and groove, and Harold knew he had only just begun to understand. The first night it happened, Harold thought little of it. A car idling on the far side of the county road wasn't unusual. Teenagers often parked there, thinking no one noticed their music playing low or the glow of cigarettes through the windshield. But when Scout began barking with a fury Harold had never heard before, the hairs on the back of his neck rose. He stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand, and saw two headlights shining steadily, not moving forward, not backing away. The vehicle sat there as if watching. Harold called out into the night, his voice carrying across the field, but no reply came. After several long minutes, the headlights dimmed and the car rolled off down the road without haste, the gravel crunching beneath its tires. Scout did not stop barking until the taillights vanished. Harold tried to convince himself it had been nothing more than kids, but when the same thing happened the following night, and the night after that, doubt began to gnaw at him. Scout's behavior grew more agitated as the visits repeated. He no longer confined his barking to the oak alone, but now ran the perimeter of the yard, growling deep in his chest, ears twitching at every sound beyond the tree line. His hackles stood up as though he sensed more than Harold could see. The ledger's presence weighed heavy in Harold's mind, and he wondered if word of its unearthing had somehow spread beyond the sheriff. One evening, Harold noticed not one car but two, parked at opposite ends of the road. Their engines ran quiet, but faint glimmers of movement betrayed the silhouettes inside. Neither approached, neither left for hours. They simply lingered as if waiting. Harold sat on his porch with his shotgun resting across his knees, a weapon he hadn't touched since his younger days. He didn't believe in paranoia, yet the steady gaze of those cars made him feel like prey being circled. Scout's barking reached a fever pitch that week, echoing across the valley. Neighbors started to complain, stopping Harold in town to tell him to keep the dog quiet. He could see in their eyes that they thought him eccentric already, the kind of man chasing shadows in his old age. Yet none of them had stood under the oak with their hand against the hollow, feeling its faint tremor. None of them had seen the symbols carved deep into grain or read the cryptic notes about deliveries to the oak. Harold knew Scout was not barking at nothing. The dog had sensed the watchers long before Harold spotted the cars. On the fourth night, Harold doused the lights in the farmhouse and waited in darkness, peering through a slit in the curtains. The vehicles returned again, 3 this time. One remained on the road, while the other 2 pulled closer, their tires whispering against the dirt path that led toward the field. Scout went wild, scratching at the door to be let out. Harold kept him inside, though his own nerves were strung tight. The men in the cars did not emerge, but Harold thought he glimpsed a camera flash, a faint strobe swallowed by the night. They were documenting something, perhaps even him. The realization chilled him. Whoever they were, they already knew enough about the Sentinel to make it worth their time. Harold clutched the ledger to his chest as he moved through the house, extinguishing every lamp until only moonlight washed the walls. He could feel eyes on him even from inside. Hours passed, and only when dawn crept across the hills did the vehicles finally disperse. Scout refused to leave his post at the window. His growls faded into low whines, but his body never relaxed. Harold scratched behind his ears, whispering reassurance that fell hollow. He understood now that the Sentinel's secret was no longer just as to wrestle with. Others had caught its scent, and unlike him, they were not driven by curiosity alone. The days that followed brought no relief. Each sunset carried with it the dread of another vigil. Harold set out lanterns at the property's edges, tried to keep up appearances by tending the garden, but the rhythm of his life had been broken. Even in town, he noticed strangers at the diner, men who did not belong, who left when he entered or spoke in hushed tones at the counter. The sheriff dismissed his concerns with a chuckle, telling him old trees drew old stories. But Harold knew this was different. By the end of the week, Harold could no longer deny the pattern. The night watchers were not random wanderers or mischievous youths. They were deliberate, patient, and waiting for him to make a mistake. Every time Scout barked at the tree, every time Harold brushed the bar from his clothes after studying the carvings, he wondered if unseen eyes were noting his every move. The Sentinel had stood for centuries, holding its secret in silence. Now, that silence was broken. Harold could feel the contest building, an unspoken race between himself and the faceless men in the cars. The dog had known first. Now Harold knew too. Whatever the tree held, it was no longer hidden. It was hunted. Harold had never thought of himself as a man who sought out academics or scholars, but the discovery of the ledger weighed too heavily for him to leave it resting in his dresser drawer. The strange cars at night, Scout's relentless fixation on the oak, and the carvings hidden beneath the bark all pressed him toward answers he couldn't find alone. One morning, after a restless night of listening to tires crunch on the road outside, he packed the ledger carefully into a satchel and drove into town. His destination was the Historical Society's office, a modest brick building wedged between the post office and a shutter hardware store. Inside, dust hung in the air, and the smell of old paper and polish was as strong as memory itself. Behind a long oak desk sat Dr. Miriam Cole, a woman whose reputation in the county preceded her. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, with a neat stack of books always within arm's reach. Years of chasing footnotes and unraveling archives had given her an air of patience, but also a quiet authority. Harold had seen her speak once at a town meeting about the early settler families, how they carried secrets in their church ledgers and town records. He remembered then that people had described her as someone who could look at a name on a page and know the weight of its story. When Harold placed a tin box and its water-stained ledger on her desk, she didn't dismiss it with a glance or wave it off as nonsense. She opened it slowly, adjusting her glasses, and began to read. Her expression shifted from curiosity to focus, and then to something closer to unease. She traced her finger over the symbols scrawled in the margins, the same ones Harold had seen carved into the oak. Finally, she closed the book gently, as if afraid it might fall apart, and leaned back in her chair. "This handwriting," she said quietly, "belongs to Elias Harrow." The name meant nothing to Harold, but the way she said it made him lean forward. She explained that Harrow had been an itinerant clerk in the late 1800s, working under different names across New England. More importantly, his name was often tied, though never directly proven, to a group known as the Preservation Brotherhood. They were less a fraternal society and more of a network. She explained, men who believed fortunes of gold, artifacts, and sometimes records of power should be hidden, not spent. Their goal wasn't charity or legacy, but control, preserving wealth outside the reach of banks and governments, ensuring it could be used later by chosen heirs or groups. The ledger, she said, was not a journal. It was a record of transactions, coded but decipherable. The deliveries to the oak weren't shipments of goods for storage. They were markers of deposits, something valuable hidden within or beneath that tree. The symbols, she noted, aligned with others she had studied in old maps, particularly ones found along abandoned railway lines and forgotten meeting halls. Each symbol served as a locator, a key that only insiders could read. Harold listened in silence, his hand resting unconsciously on the satchel as though shielding the book. Dr. Cole looked at him carefully before continuing. She explained that the Brotherhood's history was one of half-truths and rumor. Some dismissed them as nothing more than wealthy eccentrics, but stories had persisted for generations of treasure hidden in barns, in false walls, even inside gravestones. Most had never been proven. What troubled her, she admitted, was that his ledger bore the marks of authenticity, aged ink, regional dialect, even watermarks consistent with paper stock from the late 19th century. When Harold mentioned the cars that had been idling by his property, her expression tightened. She didn't laugh it off as the sheriff had. Instead, she leaned forward and lowered her voice. "If others know this ledger exists, you need to be careful. People have killed for less." She asked to hold on to the book for a few days to examine it further, but Harold shook his head. He had trusted her enough to show it, but something inside him warned against letting it leave his possession. She accepted his decision, though reluctantly, and instead copied a few pages by hand, sketching the symbols and notes. Before he left, she gave him a final warning. The oak, the ledger, and the group tied to were part of a puzzle that reached farther than his property line. As Harold drove home, the weight of her words pressed heavier than the satchel on his lap. Scout greeted him with frantic barking, circling the oak again as if reaffirming its importance. Harold placed a hand on the tree's bark and thought of Elias Harrow, of coded deliveries, of a brotherhood who had hidden their secrets beneath roots that still held them. For the first time, he realized the sentinel wasn't merely a tree. It was a vault, and now that vault was being watched. The night Harold finally pieced it together. The air was still, heavy with the damp chill of early autumn. He had spread Dr. Cole's copied notes across his kitchen table, the ledger beside them, and a lantern casting long shadows on the wall. She had spoken of constellations, of alignments that were more than mere decoration. The patterns carved into the oak's grain, when mapped carefully, mirrored the night sky as it appeared in late September. The realization struck him like a pulse of recognition. He waited until Scout began his nightly vigil by the tree, then pulled on his jacket, tucked a flashlight into his pocket, and carried the ledger with him into the dark. The oak loomed as it always did, vast and unyielding, its twisted branches clawing at the sky. Scout circled the trunk, nails scratching at the soil, tail rigid with unease. Harold pressed his palm against the bark and felt the faint grooves of the symbols beneath his fingers. He tilted his head back, scanning the heavens above the tree line. The stars were sharp and cold, clustered in patterns he remembered from Dr. Cole's sketches. When his eyes followed the arc of Cassiopeia and settled on the faint glimmer of Perseus, He saw how the shapes carved into the bark mirrored those very stars. He adjusted his stance, lining himself with the pattern, and pressed against a panel of bark framed by 3 deep etchings. At first, nothing happened. The wood felt solid, the same rough, damp texture it always held. But then, with the pressure of his shoulder, there was a faint give. A creak followed, low and reluctant, as if the tree were exhaling after centuries of silence. Scout growled low, ears pinned back, a seam open in the trunk, subtle but undeniable. Harold pressed harder, and the panel shifted aside, revealing a cavity dark as pitch. He crouched, bringing the beam of his flashlight close. What he saw was not the natural hollow of a tree, but something deliberately constructed. The cavity's walls were smooth, reinforced with iron bands driven deep into the wood. Time had warped them, but their shape remained clear, a man-made chamber, concealed behind a guise of nature. He hesitated, half expecting the sheriff's words about hollowness and harmlessness to echo back at him. But the truth before him defied casual dismissal. Someone had carved out the space, reinforced it, and then hidden it with precision that suggested skill and purpose. The opening was just wide enough for him to slip his hand through. His fingers brushed against air first, cool and stale, then something firm, wooden edges, as though boxes or crates had been stored inside. Scout barked sharply, pawing at the opening, his agitation mounting with every second Harold lingered near the void. Pulling back his hand, Harold steadied himself. He retrieved a small crowbar from the shed and returned, wedging it into the seam. With effort, the opening widened further, the bark shifting on old hinges cloaked in sap and rot. The chamber yawned open just enough to let him peer inside. The beam of his flashlight cut through the black, illuminating what looked like shelves carved into the inner wall. Upon them sat objects covered in decades of dust and webbing. Harold saw the outline of tin containers, leather pouches hardened with age, and at the very back, something metallic catching the light, just as he had glimpsed weeks earlier during the storm. His breath caught, and for a moment he forgot himself entirely, leaning closer, desperate to see what had been hidden all this time. But the deeper he looked, the more the unease grew. The air that drifted from the hollow smelled of rust, and something older, a musk of rot and earth. Scout barked again, his body rigid, pulling against an instinct Harold couldn't yet name. Still, Harold couldn't turn away. He reached in cautiously, fingertips brushing the nearest tin, which shifted with a faint clink, as though filled with something solid. He withdrew quickly, heart racing. There was no mistaking it. This chamber had been designed as a vault, a place of storage that had outlasted the men who had built it. Harold backed away, closing the panel as best he could, the bark pressing shut until it looked once again like nothing more than a scarred part of the tree. He stood in the yard, the night pressing in, scouted aside, and realized he had crossed the threshold. The ledger's symbols, the constellations, the panel, none of it was random. It was a map, a key, and it just unlocked the first part of what lay beneath the sentinel. Yet even as he stood there, the weight of discovery heavy in his chest, a question gnawed at him. Why had the chamber been left sealed for over a century, and who might still be waiting for it to be opened? He looked at the road beyond the hedges, half expecting to see headlights cutting through the dark. But there was only silence, broken by Scout's low growl and the whisper of leaves overhead. Harold knew then that what lay inside the oak was not just history. It was a secret someone had gone to great lengths to preserve, and by uncovering it, he had stepped into a story that was no longer buried. The first time Harold reached fully into the cavity, he expected to feel only wood and metal, perhaps the brittle edges of forgotten papers. What he pulled free instead was a small crate, its sides eaten by time but still firm enough to hold together. He set it down on the damp grass, brushing away cobwebs and soil. With the claw of his hammer, he pried it open. Inside were documents, railroad bonds printed on heavy parchment, their ink faded but legible, names of companies that had long since vanished into the folds of history. Some bore wax seals, cracked and dull but still intact, as though they had been locked away the very day they were signed. He sifted through them carefully, realizing the paper had been preserved by the airtight chamber of the oak. Encouraged, he returned his arm to the hollow. This time he brought out another crate, heavier and covered in rusted fittings. The lid broke apart under his hands, revealing objects of different sort. a revolver Civil War make, its cylinder frozen with age, and a bayonet with a jagged edge still faintly sharp. There were leather holsters, metal buttons, and insignias that bore the Union Star. These had not been discarded. They had been stored with care, as though waiting for someone to claim them again. Scout sniffed at the items, pawing tentatively at the bayonet before retreating, ears flattened. Harold's heart quickened as he leaned closer to the opening, flashlight beam probing deeper into the hollow. The further he looked, the more crowded it seemed. There were journals stacked in bundles, their spines warped but their bindings intact. He could see scrawled handwriting inside one of them, entries that might have chronicled the movements of men, the counting of coin, the transfer of valuables. Each item pulled him further into a narrative he hadn't asked to join, a story older than his own house, older than the very town that surrounded him. But then his light caught something else. Between two of the crates, not tucked neatly but scattered, lay bones. At first he thought they were remnants of some animal that had crawled in and died years ago, but the longer he stared, the less convincing that explanation became. The bones were too many, too varied. Some were long, thin, and unmistakably human. Femurs, ribs, finger bones curled as if frozen mid-grasp. Among them were smaller fragments that might have belonged to animals, dogs or birds perhaps, but the intermingling of species was strange, deliberate rather than accidental. He reached inside with trembling hands, brushing away soil to uncover more. A jawbone, human by its shape, lay partially concealed beneath a stack of mold-eaten cloth. The teeth were still intact, some yellowed, some missing, but it was undeniable what he held. He dropped it back into the hollow, chest tight. Scout whined low, circling the trunk as though sensing the gravity of what had been revealed. Harold stepped back, breathing hard, staring at the tree not as a relic of strength, but as a tomb. The artifacts, bonds, weapons, journals, were treasures of kind, but their preservation had been entombed with something darker. Whoever had hidden these things had also left bodies with them, as if binding wealth and death together. He couldn't shake the thought that the bones had been put there intentionally, offerings or warnings, sealed in with the artifacts, so no one would dare disturb them. He crouched again, running the flashlight across the scattered remains. The journals bore initials, but the bones bore silence. There were no names to tie them to, no stories to explain why their resting place was not a graveyard but the hollow of a tree. He imagined the brotherhood Dr. Cole had mentioned, men who operated in secrecy, who spoke in codes and symbols. If they had used the oak as a vault, had they also used it as a place of disposal? A place where loyalty and betrayal met the same fate. Sealed away, forgotten, and left to time? The thought settled like a weight in his chest. He stood motionless, the beam of his flashlight fixed on the hollow, Scout pressing against his leg as if to anchor him. The night around him seemed to grow colder, the silence deeper. He realized that what he had uncovered was not merely history, but evidence. The bones told of lives taken or lost in connection to this hidden chamber. And if others in town already knew of the oak's significance, then surely they also knew of the remains it held. Closing the panel once more, Harold lingered, staring at the tree as though it were watching him back. The sentinel had always been seen as a guardian of sorts, but now he wondered if it had been guarding a secret no one was ever meant to find. The bones among relics were not accidental. They were part of the story, a truth preserved not just in ink and iron, but in flesh and silence. For the first time, Harold wondered if Scout's barking had not been a warning of discovery, but a plea to leave the dead undisturbed. The arrival of Vanessa Knight came with little warning, though Harold had felt it building like a storm on the horizon. A black sedan rolled up his gravel drive one crisp morning, its polished sides reflecting the old oak as though it were the very thing being claimed. The woman who stepped out carried herself with an air of authority, her tailored coat too fine for the mud of rural Vermont. Behind her came two men in suits, briefcases in hand, their expressions flat, practiced, and prepared for confrontation. Scout barked furiously from the porch, his hackles raised, his body between Harold and the strangers. Vanessa's voice carried easily in the cold air, clipped and professional. She introduced herself without hesitation, her tone implying that Harold should already know her name. She said she was the great-granddaughter of Elias Knight, a man Harold recalled seeing scrawled in the ledger's pages. She explained that her family had long held interest in assets secured under brotherhood, a phrase she spoke like an incantation, rehearsed and legally shielded. Her men opened their briefcases, producing documents thick with signatures and seals, papers stamped and notarized, as though every step had been anticipated before Harold had even pried open the oak. Harold listened, his jaw tight, the weight of what he found pressing heavier now. He had lived long enough to recognize the rhythm of ownership disputes, the way words on paper could be wielded like weapons sharper than any bayonet. Vanessa's lawyers insisted the Brotherhood's property was being wrongfully withheld, and that Vanessa, as legal heir, was here to reclaim what was rightfully hers. They spoke of preservation, of generational continuity, but their eyes betrayed a different hunger, one not for heritage but for control. Harold's reply was simple, quiet, but firm. He told them the tree stood on his land, and what lay within it had been discovered there by him. He reminded them that their documents, however ornate, did not change the soil beneath their feet, nor the fact that it was his dog, his land, and his labor that had uncovered what others had kept hidden. His refusal was calm, but Scout's continued barking lent a growl of its own. Vanessa's expression hardened. She warned Harold that the matter was no longer one of personal courtesy, but of legal entitlement. She assured him papers had already been filed in court, injunctions secured, and that if he attempted to move or conceal the content of the oak, he could be held liable for theft or destruction of property. The speed of it all was startling. How could she have filed so quickly unless she had already known of the ledger, of the carvings, of the hollowed chamber? The question sank deep in Harold's mind, gnawing at him as she spoke of hearings and judgments yet to come. As the sedan finally rolled away, tires spitting gravel, Harold stood in silence at the edge of the yard. Scout pressed close to him, tail rigid, gaze locked on the path they had taken. Harold looked back at the oak, now less a tree than a contested monument, a battleground dressed in bark and shadow. The thought of lawyers and heirs claiming rights to something buried in secrecy for generations unsettled him deeply. It wasn't just the artifacts or even the bones. It was the way this woman spoke with the confidence of one who had been waiting for the tree to be opened, as though the Sentinel's secrets were never truly lost, only held in reserve until the proper claimant appeared. That night Harold sat at his kitchen table, the ledger before him, candlelight flickering across its warped pages. He turned back to Elias Knight's entries, noting how often the name appeared beside symbols that matched those carved into the oak. If Vanessa was truly of that line, then her claim was not entirely fabricated. But the Brotherhood had never been bound by public law. Their dealings had been veiled in secrecy, their assets concealed precisely to avoid such entanglements. Could their descendants now wield modern courts to enforce rights over treasures meant to remain hidden? The unease deepened when Harold thought of the bones. No claim of inheritance could explain them away. They were not assets but evidence, silent testimony that something darker had transpired beneath the guise of preservation. He wondered if Vanessa knew of them, if her polished presentation was meant to disguise awareness of what truly lay in the chamber. Perhaps she sought only the valuables, willing to ignore the remains that tied the Brotherhood's fortune to violence and death. For Harold, the intrusion was not just legal but personal. His land, his peace, and his sense of place were now invaded by forces that treated his discovery as though it were already theirs. The Brotherhood shadow had reached into his quiet life, transforming the Sentinel from a tree that had marked his boundary for decades into a beacon that called claimants from afar. He realized that refusing Vanessa's demand was not the end, but only the beginning of a struggle. Others would come, armed with documents, stories of lineage, or worse, intentions veiled in darker means. As the wind moved through the branches outside, Harold sat with the ledger and Scout at his feet, weighing the choice before him. To yield would be to abandon what his hands had uncovered. To stand firm would invite battles he had never wished for. The oak creaked in the night, its hollow secrets still intact, but now the world knew of them, and the Brotherhood's heirs were returning. Harold had lived long enough to read many journals. His fathers wore notes, old town records he once delivered as a mailman, even his own pocket diaries full of mundane weather reports and lists of errands. But nothing in his memory prepared him for the ink-stained pages that came out of crates beneath the oak. At first, he thought them no different from ledgers, the kind men use to track shipments or farm yields. Yet the more he read, the more the words took on a weight far heavier than business. The handwriting varied, sometimes neat, other times rushed and jagged, but always carrying a tone of calculation, as though each entry had been written with the cold certainty of men who assumed their secrets would never leave the hollow of the tree. One of the earliest entries Harold examined described a payment to a judge in Burlington in 1879. The figure was staggering for the time, carefully recorded with a note about ensuring the matter of Whitmore's son be laid to rest. The phrase disturbed Harold, not only because of its finality, but because the Whitmore name still existed in town, attached to a family that had seemed ordinary for generations. What had become of that son? And how had his fate been tied to money funneled through this brotherhood? Another page detailed what looked like a list of removals. Some were described in vague language. The farmer to North resolved, the witness silenced, while others bore initials beside dates, as if lives had been reduced to shorthand. The ink had bled in places from years of dampness, but the meaning was clear enough. These were not men who simply safeguarded treasure. They curated power, pruning threats with ruthless precision. Harold could almost hear their discussions around candlelit tables, deciding who would live and who would vanish into the soil. The journals also contained maps, some familiar, others impossible to place. Red circles marked quarries, riverbanks, and abandoned mills. Notes beside them spoke of placements and recoveries, terms Harold struggled to interpret, but which suggested caches beyond his own land. The oak was not unique. It was one node in a network of hidden sites, a system the Brotherhood had devised to distribute their wealth and, perhaps, to scatter their evidence. The thought chilled him, for it meant what he had unearthed was not the whole story, but only a fragment of something larger, more insidious. He turned to Brill page and found a detailed account of a meeting in 1902, where Brotherhood members argued over a missing courier. The man had apparently carried both funds and documents, but never reached his destination. The final note read simply, "Buried with discretion beneath the sentinel's roots." Harold set the journal down, his hands trembling. It was no longer speculation. The bones he and Scout had found were not anonymous remains left by chance. They were part of this ledger of secrecy, a casualty of a group who used death as casually as men used ink. The deeper Harold read, the more he realized how entangled the Brotherhood had been with the very fabric of his community. Mayors, businessmen, judges, even a pastor or two, names he recognized appeared again and again, tied to payments, favors, and silence. Families whose descendants still held sway in town had roots in this hidden corruption. Their respectability, their wealth, even their quiet charity auctions at the church all seemed tainted when seen through the lens of these records. It explained much of the stubborn pride Harold had witnessed through the years, the unspoken belief among certain families that their place was assured. They had been standing on the shoulders of buried truths, foundations cemented in fear and blood. Scout lay at Harold's feet. His ears pricked as though he too sensed the weight of what was being uncovered. Every creak of the farmhouse seemed louder, every gust of wind to the trees more insistent. Harold realized he was holding documents that could unravel more than a century of carefully guarded secrets. But to reveal them would mean turning the community inside out, exposing families whose names adorned school buildings, town halls, and the plaques lining Main Street. He wondered if he even had the strength for such a task, or if it was already too late. The journals painted a picture of Brotherhood that had not only amassed wealth, but had wielded it as a tool of dominance. Bribes secured silence, disappearances removed obstacles, and murders were dressed up as accidents or lost records. Their oak, the so-called Sentinel, had not been planted as a mere marker of endurance, but repurposed as a living vault, hiding not just relics but guilt. Every ring in its trunk had grown around secrets, each layer of bark sealing crimes the world was never meant to uncover. As Harold closed one of the journals and blew out the candlelight, he felt the darkness of the farmhouse settle heavier than usual. He thought of Vanessa Knight, her legal claims, her cold certainty. He wondered how much she truly knew, whether her polished papers accounted for stains left on the pages now spread across his table. The thought that someone could lay claim to such corruption, could call it inheritance, twisted his stomach. The oak outside groaned under the weight of night wind, as though reminding him that no matter what he chose to do, the tree had already spoken its truth. It had kept the Brotherhood's secrets for generations, but in doing so, it had also preserved the evidence of their darkest deeds. Harold sat back, his hand resting on Scout's head, and stared at the journals. They were no longer just records of wealth. They were testimony, an indictment written by men who never imagined their words would surface. The oak was not simply a vault. It was a grave, and the ghosts it held had finally found their voice. The first meeting was supposed to be routine, just another evening in the town hall where locals gathered to argue about budgets, road repairs, or the annual festival. But when word of the Sentinel and its hidden chamber spread, the familiar wooden benches filled quickly, and the air thickened with tension. Harold sat near the back with Scout curled at his feet, the dog's ears twitching at every rise in volume. He felt like a stranger in the very town he had served for decades, delivering mail to every street, knowing each face by name. Now, those same neighbors looked toward the front where developers stood in polished suits, their voices carrying authority, while preservationists clutched papers and old photographs, fighting to be heard. The developers spoke first, presenting glossy images of what the Grove could become, a modern complex of shops and apartments, with green spaces and walking paths that would, as they put it, breathe life into an underused part of town. They brushed off the oak as little more than a relic, a tree that, though old, stood in the way of progress. One man, a representative from a Boston firm, even laughed as he said no one should mourn a tree when livelihoods and tax revenue were on the line. Murmurs of agreement rippled across half the room, particularly from those who saw dollar signs in the idea of new development. Then came the preservationists, a ragtag group of teachers, local historians, and families whose children played in the Grove each summer. They brought up the Sentinel's age, its connection to local folklore, and the undeniable fact that the tree was a living witness to over 2 centuries of the town's history. Some spoke of childhood memories climbing its branches, others of community gatherings held beneath its wide canopy. But when one older woman mentioned whispers of darker stories tied to the oak, of bones and secrets, her words drew nervous glances and quick shushing. The room wanted history, but not the kind Harold had unearthed. Harold kept silent for most of it, his hand resting on Scout's back, feeling the steady rhythm of the dog's breath. He could hear the phrases repeating in the air: economic opportunity, historical preservation, property rights, and progress. Yet no one mentioned what he'd seen with his own eyes. No one dared bring up the journals, the ledger, the bones tucked away beneath roots older than their town itself. He wondered if anyone would believe him if he did. To speak those truths aloud was to risk ridicule, or worse, to invite the attention of people who had already shown they would do anything to reclaim the Brotherhood's hidden legacy. When the floor opened for public comment, Harold stood slowly, leaning heavily on the cane he had brought more out of caution than necessity. Scout followed, ears high, as if sensing the importance of the moment. The room quieted in a way that felt unnatural, as though everyone anticipated his words but wasn't sure they wanted to hear them. Harold cleared his throat and spoke simply. The tree had stood longer than any of them, longer than the roads they drove or the houses they lived in. To cut it down was not progress, but erasure. It wasn't just a tree. It was memory. It was warning. It was a part of their shared story. Some applauded. Others rolled their eyes. A council member, tired of the back and forth, asked bluntly whether Harold could provide any tangible reason to preserve the oak beyond sentiment. He thought of the box of journals hidden in his home, of the chilling words inked more than a century ago. He thought of Vanessa Knight's lawyers, of the cars idling near his property in the night. And then he thought of the silence that would come if he admitted too much. Instead, he said only that some roots ran too deep to be severed without consequence. The word hung in air, vague enough to avoid scrutiny, sharp enough to leave unease. The debate spilled long into the night, dragging on through raised voices and slammed fists. When the gavel finally struck to close the meeting, no decision had been made. Both sides left dissatisfied, muttering plans for petitions and rallies. Outside, under the dim glow of the street lamps, groups lingered, trading arguments that seemed less about the oak and more about who controlled the town's future. Harold walked past them quietly, Scout tugging gently at the leash, eager to return home. Yet Harold felt the eyes of more than just townsfolk on him. A car engine started across the street, its headlights flaring briefly before cutting off as the vehicle remained parked, waiting. In the weeks that followed, the battle for the Sentinel grew fiercer. Signs appeared on lawns: "Save our oak," painted in green, and "Grow for our town" in bold red. The local newspaper ran dueling editorials, one praising the economic boon of development, the other mourning the reckless destruction of heritage. Rumors spread of outside investors ready to swoop in, of lawsuits being drafted, of preservationists appealing to the state for intervention. Through it all, Harold remained a quiet figure, attending every meeting, walking with Scout to the grove each morning, and watching as his town seemed to fracture around a tree that had once been nothing more than a landmark. Every night, as the wind rattled through the branches, Harold felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He knew what the Sentinel truly guarded, and he knew the risk of speaking aloud. But with each passing day, the noise grew louder, the side sharper, and the oak less a tree than a symbol. To the developers, it was an obstacle. To the preservationists, it was a monument. To Harold, it was a grave marker that no one else yet recognized. And so, as the battle raged on in public, Harold held his silence in private, the secrets of the Brotherhood locked behind his weathered eyes and the steadfast bark of his loyal dog. The final days of autumn had left the air brittle, the wind pulling the last dry leaves from their branches and scattering them like whispers across Harold's yard. The oak loomed heavier than ever, its trunk darkened from weeks of rain, its bark cracked deep enough now to reveal more than just age. Harold had begun to think he had seen all it had to offer: the carvings, the chamber, the bones, the journals that stained history with truth no one wanted to face. Yet Scout still barked. Not every day now, not with the same frenzy as before, but with a kind of focused certainty. Each time, it was directed toward the same part of the hollow they had uncovered, as though the dog understood there was something left hidden in its depths, something no human hand had yet dared to touch. Harold lowered himself carefully one morning, lantern in hand, and placed it on the damp ground inside the cavity. The air was close and stale, filled with the scent of old wood and older secrets. Scout's nose pressed into crevices of the trunk, his paws scrabbling at a section Harold had ignored, thinking it solid. But now, under the dog's insistence, he pressed a hand to it and felt a faint give. It wasn't natural rot. It was deliberate. The panel, disguised with bark and sap long hardened, slid slightly under his touch. His heart quickened. The sound of his own pulsed loud in his ears, as if the tree itself had been waiting for this exact moment. He pressed harder, and the wood shifted just enough for Scout to force his nose inside. The dog whined, pawing more frantically until the panel gave way, revealing a narrow slit deeper within. Harold leaned closer, the lantern light stretching shadows long across the cavity, until something metallic caught his eye. It was wedged tightly, not a box or weapon or ledger this time, but a disc, thick, heavy, and etched with markings so precise they looked untouched by time. With effort, Harold pried it free, the cold weight of it startling against his weathered palms. It was the Brotherhood seal, the Master Seal, as the inscription around its edge declared. Harold turned it slowly in the light, reading words carved with careful intent. Asterisk, this oak shall bear the burden. Its keepers shall not be those who claim by law or power, but those who listen when others ignore. Asterisk, the phrase sank deep into him, its meaning heavier than any artifact yet uncovered. This wasn't merely a hiding place for wealth. It was a trial, a measure of patience, loyalty, and faith. He sat back on the cold ground, Scout pressing against his knee, tail thumping once as if in quiet satisfaction. The dog had known, not in words or reason, but in instinct, in that tireless devotion that had driven him to bark, to claw, to return to the tree even when others scoffed. Scout had passed where men with greed and lawyers with papers had failed. The oak had demanded not possession, but guardianship, and it had chosen, not through signatures or deeds, but through the unshakable bond between a man and his dog. The seal's surface bore more than words. Around its edge, Harold traced symbols that matched the ledger, matched the carvings hidden in the bark. They weren't marks of wealth, but warnings, a reminder of what greed had cost those who came before. Bones buried in silence, names struck from history, power traded in darkness. The oak had held it all, not just to preserve it, but to test whether anyone left would see beyond the gold and bonds to the truth that mattered. By the time Harold climbed out of the hollow, dawn had broken in pale colors across the Vermont sky. Scout trotted ahead, no longer barking, no longer restless. There was peace in the dog's step, a kind of closure that Harold understood. The Sentinel had given up its final secret, and with it, its judgment. It had not chosen Vanessa Knight with her papers and threats, nor the developers with their promises of progress. It had not chosen the sheriff, nor the historians, nor even the town itself. It had chosen a man who had listened when no one else had, and the dog who had refused to be silenced. Harold placed a seal on his table that morning and stared at it while Scout curled at his feet, finally calm. He thought about what it meant, what he should do. The lawyers would never accept words carved in metal over the ink on their contracts. The developers would laugh. The preservationists would cheer, but only for their cause. None of them understood that the Oak's legacy wasn't meant for courts or headlines. It was meant to remind, to warn, to prove that not everything buried should be unearthed for gain. Some things needed keepers, not owners, and so Harold made his choice in silence. The seal would not leave his home. It would remain hidden, as the Brotherhood had intended, but under a different kind of guardianship. Scout lifted his head, eyes steady on Harold's, as though confirming the decision. For the first time in months, the oak stood quiet, its branches creaking only with the natural sway of wind. No watchers idled in cars outside, no restless barking pierced the night. The test was over, and the Sentinel had its answer. The secret of the oak was never about treasure. It was about loyalty, endurance, and the stubbornness to believe in what others dismissed. In the end, it wasn't gold that proved the worth of a guardian, but the echo of a dog's bark and the man willing to hear it.